Have you ever had a moment in life where everything just collapsed? Where the world you knew vanished in the blink of an eye, and all that remained was a haunting silence, a gnawing question echoing in your soul. Why me? If you've ever felt like life handed you more than your fair share of pain, if you've been betrayed, abandoned, or pushed to the edge, you're not alone. Because once upon a time, in a dry and dusty corner of the world, there lived a woman named Ruth, whose story begins in sorrow but ends in royalty. And what happens in between is a powerful, soul-stirring reminder that even when everything seems lost, destiny may be quietly unfolding behind the scenes. This is the journey that millions have forgotten, but you're about to rediscover it in a way you've never heard before. Now, let me ask you something, and be honest with yourself. Have you ever wondered why certain people rise from nothing to greatness while others fade into obscurity? Why some lives seem chosen? And more importantly, could you be on the edge of your own transformation without even realizing it? Stick with me, because by the time this story ends, you're not just going to understand Ruth's journey, you're going to see yourself in it. Yes, you. You didn't click this video by accident. Something drew you here. A search. A whisper in your spirit. A hunger for more. And I promise, what you're about to uncover isn't just a biblical tale, it's a blueprint for breakthrough. So stay with me, because every second counts, and I'm about to walk you through one of the most unbelievable underdog stories ever told. Let's set the scene. Picture it. Ancient Moab. A land both beautiful and brutal. The kind of place where faith was rare and survival was a daily battle. This is where our story begins, with a young woman, newly married, full of hope, trying to build a life. But within a few short years, her world is shattered. Her husband dies. Her brother-in-law dies. Her father-in-law gone. Just like that, in a whirlwind of grief and confusion, Ruth finds herself a widow in a foreign land, clinging to nothing but the fading memories of a love that once was and a future that now feels impossibly out of reach. Can you imagine that level of pain? Of disorientation? She's not just grieving a husband, she's grieving her place in the world. She's left standing in the ashes of a life that's no longer hers. Now here's where it gets intense, and where the real journey begins. Her mother-in-law, Naomi, crushed by her own sorrow, decides to return to Bethlehem, the land of her people. It's a bold move, a dangerous journey for two women with no protection, no provision, no certainty. And Naomi tells Ruth to stay behind in Moab, to go back to her people, her comfort zone, her safety net. And here's the moment, the turning point, the master move that changes history. Ruth refuses. She looks Naomi in the eye and utters words so raw, so powerful, they've been quoted for centuries. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. That, my friend, is where everything shifts. That single act of loyalty, that fierce faith in the unknown, set Ruth on a path that would take her from a grieving widow to the great-grandmother of King David, the ancestor of Jesus himself. But how did it all unfold? How did a poor, foreign widow who had nothing to her name end up being part of the most royal bloodline in history? What secret decisions, divine encounters, and inner battles led to such a miraculous outcome? And more importantly, what can you learn from her journey today? Whether you're facing rejection, uncertainty, or waiting for your own breakthrough. You see, this isn't just a history lesson. It's a spiritual roadmap, a survival guide for the soul. And I'm going to walk you through every moment, from the tears and trials to the triumph and transformation. Because Ruth's story isn't about luck. It's about strategy, purpose, and the kind of faith that dares to risk it all. And that kind of faith, it can change your life too. So if you're someone who's been searching YouTube for answers, maybe typing things like God's plan for my life, how to keep faith in hard times, inspirational stories of women in the Bible, or true biblical transformation, then you're in the right place. Because Ruth's journey isn't just inspirational, it's deeply personal. It speaks to those late-night questions, the invisible battles, the private heartbreaks you've never told anyone about. You know what I'm talking about, the kind of pain you smile through while pretending everything's fine. The silent struggles that never make it into your social media posts. But God sees them. And through Ruth's story, He's speaking directly to you right here, right now. And let's be real, this world is full of people who judge by status, by appearance, by success. But Ruth's story flips the script. It's about what's inside. About quiet strength, hidden courage, and the favor that finds you when no one else is looking. Ruth didn't have followers. She didn't have wealth. She wasn't famous. But she had something most people don't. Faith that fights. Loyalty that lasts. Humility that opens doors no human hand could shut. And that is what caught the attention of a man named Boaz, a man who would become her redeemer, protector, and the bridge to a divine legacy she never could have imagined. But hold on, don't jump ahead. Because Boaz isn't just a romantic figure in this story. He's a symbol, a foreshadowing. And their meeting? It didn't happen by chance. There's a hidden hand in this story, a divine choreography at work. And when you see how all the pieces come together, you'll realize God isn't random. He's intentional. Even in your pain, even in your waiting, even when everything feels like it's falling apart, you're not forgotten. You're being positioned. Now, let me speak directly to you for a moment, not just as a storyteller, but as someone who sees you through the screen. I know life hasn't been easy. I know you've faced things that should have broken you. And maybe you've been asking, does God even see me? The answer is yes. And through Ruth's story, you're going to discover that when you feel like you're at the end, it might just be the beginning of something far greater than you can imagine. So, don't click away. Don't miss what's about to unfold. Because the next few minutes could unlock something in you that's been buried for far too long. Something sacred, powerful, and absolutely life-changing. We're about to dive deeper into Ruth's arrival in Bethlehem. The whispers, the stares, the desperate days spent gleaning leftover grain in the fields. The moment when Ruth meets Boaz. The tension, the mystery, the cultural risks she takes by lying at his feet in the dark. We'll explore what really happened on that threshing floor. Why Boaz didn't just marry her right away. The hidden rival. The ancient customs. The spiritual stakes. And most importantly, the breakthrough that turned a broken past into a glorious future. But before we go there, before we cross into the next chapter of Ruth's breathtaking story, I want you to remember this one truth. You are not disqualified. No matter what you've been through, no matter what you've lost, your story is not over. Just like Ruth, you may be standing in the middle of a painful season, but if you keep walking, if you keep showing up, something incredible is waiting on the other side. And this story? It just might hold the key to unlocking it. So buckle up. Because in the next section, Ruth's quiet obedience is going to collide with divine favor. And the outcome? Let's just say, history will never be the same. As Ruth stood on the outskirts of Bethlehem, watching the bustling town with weary eyes and dust-covered feet, she couldn't help but feel the weight of invisible eyes pressing down on her back. Whispers trailed behind her like shadows, soft, cutting phrases in a language she only half understood. That's Naomi's daughter-in-law, the Moabite. Didn't her kind worship idols? The streets of Bethlehem, though familiar to Naomi, felt foreign to Ruth. She was a stranger, an outsider marked by grief and origin, silently judged by a people who measured worth by bloodlines and past sins. But Ruth didn't flinch. Behind her young eyes lived a storm that had already swallowed more than most could survive. She had buried her husband in cold Moabite soil, left behind the only family she'd ever known, and walked mile after mile through the jagged wilderness with a woman who barely had the strength to speak. Still, she came. Not because it was easy, but because something inside her whispered that this was where the answers lived. She didn't know how, or why, only that she had to be here. Each morning in this new place, Ruth would rise before the sun and slip out into the edges of the barley fields, where the workers were already hard at it. She didn't have a plan, just a hunger, a quiet desperation. She gleaned the leftover stalks from the corners of the fields, the ones no one else wanted, her back aching, her palms scraped, her face sticky with sweat. It was hard labor, humbling labor, but she never complained. Somewhere in her silence was a kind of dignity that the other women didn't understand. They talked. They laughed. They watched her with sideways glances. Who was this foreign girl who kept showing up day after day, never asking for help, never looking for pity? But Ruth didn't see them. Her eyes were always on the grain, on the dirt, on the simple truth that if she didn't gather enough, she and Naomi would meet. And still, beneath all that struggle, there was something else, something rising quietly beneath the surface. A growing sense that she wasn't just here to survive. She was here to witness something. To be found by something. Or someone. And then one morning something shifted. The overseer's voice changed. The workers' eyes grew wide. There was movement in the distance, a figure walking through the field. Tall. Confident. A presence that made the rustling stalks fall silent for a moment. His name was Boaz. Wealthy. Respected. A man of deep heritage and deeper mystery. No one knew why he was out that day. He rarely visited the field himself, but there he was, watching her. Not with suspicion or contempt like the others, but with curiosity, interest, and maybe something more. He asked about her, listened to her story, left instructions for the workers to protect her, even let her gather from the better parts of the field. To Ruth, it felt like nothing more than kindness, another mercy in a long line of tiny miracles. But to Naomi, it was something else entirely. Back at home that evening, Naomi's face changed the moment Ruth told her whose field she'd worked in. A flicker of recognition, a gasp of hope. Boaz, she said slowly, is one of our kinsman redeemers. The term meant little to Ruth then, but Naomi knew. It was more than a coincidence, more than a kind gesture. It was divine alignment, a thread in the tapestry of something bigger. And that's when the plan began to form, not out of manipulation or desperation, but out of an ancient promise. A lever of redemption that could be pulled if all the right pieces fell into place. But here's where things get interesting, because what Ruth and Naomi didn't know was that they weren't the only ones watching. In a town as small as Bethlehem, eyes are everywhere. Boaz's attention hadn't gone unnoticed. Neither had Ruth's sudden appearance. And though her hands were calloused from work and her clothes worn thin, there was something about her that unsettled people. Some said it was her beauty. Others claimed it was her presence. But behind the friendly smiles of the market and the polite greetings at the well, there were quieter conversations happening in corners and alleyways. Rumors. Questions. Who was she really? What did she want? And why was Boaz, widowed, wealthy, respected, suddenly so interested in a foreigner? As the days passed, strange things began to happen. Workers reported tools missing, bundles of grain tampered with. One man claimed he saw someone lurking near the fields late at night. Another swore Ruth had been followed home one evening by a cloaked figure. But when confronted, no one could say for certain. It could have been nothing, or it could have been a warning. Then came the whispers about another relative, closer than Boaz, who might stake his claim before the Redeemer could. He hadn't been seen in public much, but his name carried weight. He was known to be calculating, ambitious, and not the type to step aside easily. Naomi didn't trust him. Ruth hadn't even met him. But the idea of him loomed like a shadow over their fragile hope. And what of Boaz himself? Generous, yes. Noble, perhaps. But not without secrets of his own. There were gaps in his story, years of his life that no one talked about. Why had he never remarried? What ghosts lingered behind those kind eyes? Was his kindness toward Ruth just duty, or was it something deeper? And if it was love, what would he risk to keep her safe? What if doing the right thing meant going against his own bloodline, his own legacy? You see, in the Bible, things are often painted in clean strokes, black and white, good and evil. But the truth of Ruth's story is far more layered. Behind every decision was tension. Behind every encounter, a ripple effect. Behind every act of faith, the potential for betrayal. And as Ruth prepared to take the boldest step of her life, sneaking into the threshing floor at night, lying at Boaz's feet as a quiet request for redemption, the stakes were higher than she realized. She wasn't just asking for marriage. She was asking for protection, for covering, for her place in a world that had tried to erase her. And someone didn't want that to happen. The threshing floor was quiet that night, the air heavy with the scent of grain and uncertainty. Ruth's heart pounded in her chest as she moved closer, the moonlight casting long shadows across the ground. She could hear Boaz breathing, asleep near the grain pile. Every step she took felt like a lifetime. She knelt, uncovered his feet, and waited, vulnerable, exposed, holding her breath for what would come next. But just before Boaz stirred, a faint sound echoed in the dark. A footstep? A whisper? A presence that shouldn't have been there? Someone was watching. And what Ruth didn't yet know was that this night would change everything. Not just for her, not just for Boaz, but for the future of a kingdom not yet born. And the question now is, who else had something to lose if Ruth found her place in the story? The answer lies in what happens next. Boaz's eyes opened slowly in the darkness, startled by the coolness near his feet and the faint silhouette of a woman kneeling beside him. For a split second, instinct kicked in, alarm, confusion, even fear, but then recognition softened his expression. "Who are you?" he asked, voice low but steady. Ruth answered quietly, heart pounding in her chest. "I am your servant, Ruth. Spread your garment over me, for you are a redeemer." There was a pause, longer than she expected. He didn't speak right away. In that moment, she couldn't tell if it was hesitation or reverence. Then, finally, his voice returned, filled with admiration and something else, something deeper. "You have shown great kindness, greater than before, and now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do all that you ask." A surge of hope rushed through Ruth's chest. It was happening. The plan was working. But just as quickly as that warmth came, his next words turned her stomach cold. "However, there is another, a closer redeemer than I. If he is willing, he will redeem you. But if not, I will." It was a twist she hadn't expected, not another redeemer. Not someone else with legal rights over her future. Boaz told her to wait until morning, promised to handle it, and sent her away before dawn with barley and blessings. But Ruth couldn't sleep that night. Neither could Naomi. The next morning, Boaz went to the town gate, where deals were made and justice was served. Ruth waited anxiously, unaware that her fate now rested in the hands of a man she had never met, someone who had every legal right to claim her, but none of the heart to cherish her. And while Bethlehem buzzed with its usual activity, something else was happening beneath the surface, something that would soon shake Ruth's fragile world once again. Later that day, when Naomi sent Ruth to the marketplace to gather news, she expected whispers about Boaz's bold move, or maybe the outcome of his meeting with the mysterious relative. Instead, she returned with nothing but odd stares and unanswered questions. People were quiet, too quiet. The usual chatter had gone flat. One woman Ruth knew from the fields avoided eye contact. Another gave her a hesitant nod, then quickly walked away. That eerie silence followed her home, and by nightfall, Naomi's expression had darkened. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. The next morning, Boaz didn't appear at the fields. Ruth waited. Watched. Listened. Nothing. No news. No message. And then, almost too conveniently, a scroll, sealed and unsigned, was left at the threshold of Naomi's home. Naomi opened it slowly, eyes scanning the delicate writing. It wasn't what Ruth had hoped. The other redeemer had agreed to take the claim. No name, no details, just a declaration that the matter was resolved. But Naomi's hands trembled, and not from age. She'd seen that handwriting before. Years ago. From someone long gone. Someone she had every reason to believe was dead. As the night wore on, Naomi shared what she hadn't dared say before. There had been a falling out in her family. Years back, long before they moved to Moab, a land deal had gone sour. A cousin, close enough to claim the Redeemer title, had been accused of manipulating the elders, exploiting loopholes, and ultimately disappearing when his schemes were exposed. No one had heard from him in years. Naomi had hoped he'd died in exile, but the scroll proved otherwise. He was back. And he wasn't just claiming Ruth. He was erasing Boaz's move, closing off the path they had hoped would lead to redemption. Worse yet, the evidence of Boaz's legal offer, the witnesses, the parchment, even the seal, had gone missing from the town gate's archive.
Gone.
No trace. As if it never happened, panic set in. How had it disappeared? Who had the power to do that? And what did this hidden redeemer really want? Because Ruth wasn't property. She wasn't a bargaining chip. But something about the way this was unfolding suggested that to someone, she was exactly that, a means to an end. Naomi, shaken but not broken, urged Ruth to lie low, to not return to the fields, to stay silent. But Ruth couldn't. Not after everything. She needed answers. And the only way to find them was to go back, alone. She returned to the fields under the guise of gleaning, hoping to speak to one of Boaz's workers. But they were different now, more guarded, less open. One man barely acknowledged her. Another acted as if he didn't recognize her. Finally, she found an older woman who had once shared bread with her beneath the olive trees. The woman hesitated, glanced around nervously, then leaned in close. "You should leave this place," she whispered. "There are things you don't understand. People watching. It's not safe." Ruth pressed for more, but the woman shook her head and walked away. That night, as Ruth lay awake, trying to make sense of what was happening, she couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion that something bigger was unraveling. This wasn't just about redemption. Someone was pulling strings behind the scenes, someone with the power to alter records, silence witnesses, and push Boaz out of the picture. And whoever it was, they didn't want Ruth to dig any deeper. But Ruth had come too far to turn back now. She had left behind everything, her home, her family, her gods, for a chance at a life she believed had meaning. She wasn't just going to let it be rewritten by someone hiding behind shadows. As she sat in the silence, staring at the dying candle on the table, something caught her eye. Tucked beneath the folds of her cloak was a small slip of cloth, worn, faded, stitched with a symbol she didn't recognize. It hadn't been there before. She hadn't placed it. Someone had been in her room, and they had left a message. But what did it mean, and who wanted her to find it? The truth was no longer hiding in the dark. It was creeping closer, and the next move was hers. Ruth sat frozen in place, her fingers tightening around the piece of cloth that now felt heavier than stone. The symbol stitched into the fabric was crude yet deliberate, a jagged design resembling an ancient seal, one Naomi did not recognize, but the shape stirred something distant in her memory, something she had buried long ago. As Ruth showed it to Naomi by candlelight, the older woman's face paled. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch it, then recoiled slightly, as if it burned her skin. "I've seen this before," Naomi whispered, barely audible, her eyes darting to the window. "Years ago, before we left for Moab. It was connected to the council. A secret mark used by men who didn't want their decisions recorded in public view. Men who worked in shadows. This wasn't left here by accident, Ruth. It's a warning or a summons." Ruth could feel her chest tighten with unease. If what Naomi said was true, someone with influence and reach had not only been inside their home, but was playing a dangerous game, one that had roots buried deeper in Bethlehem's soil than she had imagined. And while Ruth wrestled with this new layer of the mystery, something else was unfolding just beyond their notice. In the northern end of town, a young servant boy named Eli, who worked at the House of the Elders, was cleaning the records room when he stumbled upon something strange. Tucked behind a stack of unused scrolls, he found a piece of parchment half-charred, nearly crumbling in his hands. But what caught his eye was the seal, Boaz's seal. Partially melted, barely legible, but undeniably his. The document appeared to be part of the original declaration Boaz had made at the gate regarding Ruth. But the scroll had been marked with a second seal, one that had been forcibly removed, leaving only a ghostly imprint. Eli, young but clever, knew this document should not be there, should not even exist. And worse, he knew that if he were caught with it, his life might be in danger. That night, with trembling hands and a pounding heart, Eli crept through the alleys until he reached Naomi's door. He knocked softly. Ruth answered, startled to see the boy standing there with dirt-streaked cheeks and eyes full of urgency. He didn't speak at first, just held out the brittle scroll. Ruth took it and quickly unrolled what was left. As Naomi lit a nearby oil lamp, her breath caught in her throat. This is what we needed, she whispered. Proof. Boaz did make the claim, and someone tried to erase it. But Eli shook his head nervously, glancing over his shoulder. I wasn't the only one who saw it, he murmured. Someone else was watching me. I don't think I was supposed to find it. The words landed like thunder in Ruth's chest. If someone else knew the scroll had resurfaced, then they would come looking. They couldn't hide the evidence for long. And what terrified Ruth the most wasn't just the idea that someone had sabotaged Boaz. It was the growing sense that the real threat wasn't coming from outside the community, but from within. Someone close. Someone trusted. The enemy wasn't wearing a mask. They were walking freely through the streets, smiling during the day, moving silently at night. And then came the second message. It arrived not for Ruth this time, but for Boaz. A servant delivered it to him in secret as he returned home late one evening. Boaz opened the note carefully, expecting more political nonsense or transactional talk. But what he read chilled him to the bone. It was unsigned, written in the same hand that had penned the scroll Naomi received. You have interfered in matters that do not concern you. Withdraw your claim, or the truth about your past will no longer remain buried. Boaz's jaw clenched as he read it again, then burned the parchment in the hearth before anyone else could see it. That single sentence unraveled him more than any legal obstacle. Because Boaz did have a past. One he had worked for years to outrun. One that, if exposed, could discredit him, disgrace his family name, and make any claim on Ruth null and void. The truth was, Boaz was not born into prominence. His wealth came later, after years of silence and calculated moves. His mother had been Rahab, the woman who had once lived in Jericho, known by reputation for the life she led. Though her faith had rewritten her story in the eyes of God, the eyes of men were less forgiving. Boaz had been mocked as a child, treated like an outsider in his own land. He'd clawed his way up, stone by stone, building his reputation so carefully that only a few elders even remembered where he came from. And now someone threatened to bring it all crashing down. Not just his pride, but Ruth's future. Their future. Everything they had started to build was in danger, not because they lacked truth or love, but because someone feared what they represented. Hope. As Boaz wrestled with that letter, torn between protecting Ruth or revealing everything, a new figure emerged from the edges of the town's political shadows. A man named Dathan. Older, quiet, almost invisible. But those who knew the town's history remembered his name as one whispered with caution. He had once been on the council before leaving suddenly, under accusations that had never been proven, just whispered into silence. Now he was back, attending meetings with the elders, revisiting old land claims, inserting himself where no one had asked. And wherever Dathan went, strange things seemed to follow. Missing records. Sudden shifts in loyalty. Silent glances exchanged between council members who used to speak freely. It wasn't long before Naomi recognized him, though he looked older, more tired, his eyes darker than she remembered. He had been there before she left Bethlehem. He had known her husband. He had opposed the idea of marrying outside the clan. And now he was inserting himself into Ruth's story again. The pieces were starting to connect. But what Naomi couldn't understand was why now. Why this level of manipulation? And why Ruth? That answer hadn't yet revealed itself. But then something happened that no one could explain. The scroll Eli had delivered, the one they had hidden carefully, vanished. Without signs of a break-in, without a trace of who had taken it. Naomi was devastated. Ruth was furious. And Eli was gone. No one had seen him since the morning after he delivered the parchment. His quarters were empty. His bedding cold. His trail vanished like dust in the wind. Ruth stood in the center of the room that evening, the fire flickering low, the tension in her chest almost unbearable. She had come to Bethlehem seeking refuge. She had endured whispers, poverty, and fear. She had trusted Boaz, followed Naomi's wisdom, waited patiently for redemption. But now she understood something she hadn't before. This was never just about land or marriage or even survival. It was about power. And someone would do anything to keep it. But who?
And why?
And most of all, what had they done with Eli? The silence offered no answers. But the storm was far from over. The night air in Bethlehem had turned bitter, colder than it should have for the season, and Ruth felt it deep in her bones. Not just the chill of the wind, but the unsettling weight of something she couldn't quite name. It was no longer just about the missing scroll or the boy who had vanished without a trace. It was the way people looked at her now, how conversations stopped when she passed, how Naomi's once trusted neighbors now closed their doors a second too fast. Every sound outside after dark made her flinch. Every footstep on the road made her heart lurch in her chest. And worst of all, there was the feeling that someone, some unseen watcher, was always just a few steps behind. It wasn't paranoia if it was real, and Ruth's instincts, sharpened by loss and survival, were now screaming at her that something had shifted. Danger was no longer a distant possibility. It was here. It was watching. 2 days after Eli disappeared, Boaz stopped coming to the fields. No messages. No explanation. His servants wouldn't speak, and when Ruth tried to approach the estate, she found the gates locked tight, the guards posted like sentinels who hadn't been there before. One of the women who had once laughed with Ruth in the barley fields wouldn't meet her gaze, only muttered something about orders from above before slipping away into the crowd. Ruth turned back, pulse racing, knowing this wasn't coincidence. Boaz was being kept away, not by choice, but by force. The silence was orchestrated, and someone, somewhere, was making sure Ruth couldn't reach the one person who had ever offered her protection. Her connection to Boaz had become a threat to someone's plan, and now they were severing it before it could change anything. That night, Ruth couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening for sounds beyond the usual creaks of wood and whisper of wind. It was well past midnight when she heard it, the soft scrape of something against the outer wall of their home. At first she told herself it was a stray animal, maybe a broken shutter in the breeze. But then came the unmistakable creak of a floorboard just outside her door. She rose silently, heart pounding so loud she was certain it would wake Naomi, who had finally drifted into a fragile sleep. Ruth reached for the heavy iron candle holder beside the bed, holding it tight in her hands as she moved toward the door. She counted to 3 before she flung it open, half expecting to come face to face with a shadowed figure. But the hallway was empty. No movement. No sound. Only the faint smell of something she couldn't quite place, burnt parchment or maybe oil. She stepped forward slowly, checking the entryway, the windows, even the cellar. Nothing. No signs of entry. But on the small wooden table by the door, placed precisely where she couldn't miss it, was another slip of cloth, identical to the first, except this one was soaked in something dark and red. Not blood, but paint, or was it? Either way, the message was clear. They hadn't just been in the house. They had been inches from her. And she hadn't even known. By morning, Naomi found her still seated at the table, clutching the cloth with trembling hands. Ruth tried to stay strong, but the exhaustion was starting to chip away at her resolve. Naomi looked into her eyes and saw the truth. Ruth wasn't just scared. She was starting to doubt everything. Who could they trust now? Who hadn't been compromised? The council was silent. Boaz was unreachable. Eli was gone. And whoever was orchestrating this chaos had infiltrated their lives so completely that not even their home felt safe. Naomi tried to comfort her, but there was a hollow edge to her words now. Even she, with all her wisdom and resilience, couldn't hide the fear any longer. Later that day, as Ruth walked through the market, keeping her head down, trying to look invisible, she heard a woman scream. The sound pierced the usual market chatter and turned heads instantly. Ruth ran toward the noise, only to find a crowd gathering around a well near the edge of the square. A man had collapsed, his face twisted in terror, clutching his chest. Some said he had been poisoned. Others claimed he had seen something so horrific it had stopped his heart. As Ruth pushed through the crowd, she recognized him, one of the elders who had been present at the gate the day Boaz made his claim. the very man who had spoken in favor of Boaz. Now he was dead, and just like that, another voice had been silenced. Not by accident. This was methodical. The message couldn't have been clearer. Stop digging.
Stop asking.
Stay quiet or be next. That evening, Ruth didn't return home. She wandered the outskirts of Bethlehem, trying to clear her head, trying to make sense of it all. She found herself standing by the edge of the barley fields where she had first met Boaz. The land that had once symbolized hope now felt haunted. As the wind rustled the stalks around her, she thought about everything she had left behind in Moab, her family, her culture, her identity, to follow Naomi into the unknown. She had believed there was a purpose in it, that her faith and sacrifice would lead to something greater. But now that path was buried beneath fear, lies, and betrayal. Was she being punished for her loyalty? Or was she meant to uncover something no one else had the courage to face? And just when she thought she couldn't carry the weight any longer, she noticed something glinting in the dirt near the edge of the field. She bent down and pulled out a small pendant, covered in dust, the chain broken. It was the same one she had seen Eli wear around his neck the day he brought the scroll. Her breath caught in her throat. He had been here, recently, and he hadn't left willingly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, Ruth knew the time for silence had ended. The danger was real. The lies were deeper than she'd imagined. And somewhere, in the heart of this broken town, someone still held the answers she needed, someone who was watching her every move. But if they thought fear would stop her, they didn't know Ruth. Not yet. Because now she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for truth. And she was willing to risk everything to find it. Ruth stood alone in the barley field, Eli's pendant clenched tightly in her fist, when a voice behind her shattered the silence. You shouldn't be out here, not tonight. She turned swiftly, heart jumping, only to find Naomi standing a few paces behind her, cloak drawn tightly around her shoulders. But something was different. Her voice carried an edge Ruth hadn't heard before, something steeled and strange. Naomi stepped forward, her eyes not quite meeting Ruth's. We need to talk, she said quietly. Ruth nodded, her instincts humming with unease. The two women walked in silence back toward the house, the sky bruised with nightfall, but when they reached the door, Naomi didn't go inside. Instead, she paused, then looked at Ruth in a way that felt colder than the night wind. There's something I should have told you, she whispered. Something I kept buried because I thought it would protect you. But I see now keeping it from you only made things worse. Ruth felt her stomach turn. Naomi had been her anchor since the beginning, the one person she trusted without question. Now that trust was shaking. Naomi motioned for her to sit on the stone bench outside the house, far from listening ears. The scroll that Eli found, Naomi began. It wasn't just a record of Boaz's claim. It was a decoy. The real document was never hidden in the council's records. Ruth blinked, stunned. Then where is it? Naomi hesitated, then lowered her eyes. I have it. The world seemed to tilt sideways for a moment. Ruth couldn't speak. Naomi continued, her voice trembling slightly now. I found it the day after Boaz made the claim, tucked beneath the floorboards of the council hall. I knew immediately it was dangerous. It not only confirmed Boaz's claim to redeem you, it named those who opposed it. Men in power. Men who forged new documents to make it disappear. I thought if I held on to it quietly, I could protect you and Boaz from retaliation. But I didn't realize how far they'd go. When Eli came to us, I panicked. I thought if I gave him a copy, it would distract them. I never expected him to find the truth on his own. That was my mistake. Ruth stood, her mind spinning. So Eli knew. That's why he disappeared. Naomi nodded slowly. They must have found out he had seen the original. That's when everything shifted. That's when the warning started. Ruth could barely breathe. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked, her voice hoarse with betrayal. Because I didn't think you were ready, Naomi answered, not harshly, but with regret. I was wrong. You've always been stronger than I gave you credit for. But before Ruth could respond, another voice rang out from the shadows. She's not the only one who kept secrets. Both women turned sharply. A tall figure stepped forward from behind the olive trees, Boaz. His cloak was covered in dust, his eyes darker than Ruth had ever seen them. He looked exhausted, worn down by something far heavier than travel or silence. Ruth rushed forward, relief flooding her at the sight of him. But he didn't embrace her. Instead, he reached into his satchel and pulled out something small and wrapped in cloth. "I left not because I was forced to," he said quietly. "I left because I had to uncover the truth myself. And I did. But it's not what we thought." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a signet ring. Old, gold, and etched with the same jagged symbol that had appeared on the cloth warnings. Ruth froze, staring at it. "This was my father's," Boaz said, his voice hollow. He was part of the original council that controlled land inheritance long before Bethlehem had any real law. And that symbol? It wasn't a warning. It was a mark of allegiance. A secret brotherhood created to keep bloodlines pure, to prevent outsiders from gaining power. He looked directly at Ruth now, eyes full of pain. "They weren't trying to destroy us because of a land claim. They were trying to erase you. Because you're Moabite. Because they feared what your bloodline could mean if tied to mine." The revelation hit like thunder. All the lies, the silence, the missing scrolls, it had never been about legal rights or procedures. It had been about legacy, about control, about erasing the idea that someone from outside their tradition could be part of a holy lineage. Ruth staggered back, the implications unraveling in her mind. "So this wasn't just political," she said slowly. "This was personal." Boaz nodded grimly. "They saw us as a threat to everything they built. Not because of sin or scandal, but because if someone like you became part of the royal line, it would rewrite their entire history." Ruth could barely speak. Her chest ached, not just from fear but from the weight of what it meant. They're willing to kill for a lie. Naomi stepped beside her, hand on her shoulder. "And now that you know the truth," she said quietly, "they'll come for you too." The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. But none were more pressing than the one Ruth now held like fire in her chest. If they would go so far to stop her, how many more had already been silenced? And worse still, was there someone among them, someone she still trusted, who was feeding them every move she made? A noise in the distance shattered the moment, a loud knock at the door, sudden and sharp. None of them moved, because this time, the danger wasn't creeping in the shadows. It was standing on the doorstep. The knock came again, louder this time, more urgent, like whoever was outside wasn't just demanding attention but sending a message. "We know you're in there, and we're done waiting." Ruth's breath caught in her throat as she locked eyes with Boaz, then Naomi. For a split second, all three stood frozen, each of them calculating what to do, each aware that one wrong move could change everything. Boaz stepped back toward the door, hand near the dagger tucked beneath his cloak, but Ruth reached out, stopping him. "Wait," she whispered, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "If this is the moment they've been planning for, we can't react with fear. We can't give them what they want." But even as she said it, part of her wasn't sure if she believed it. Every instinct screamed that opening that door might be the last thing they ever did. But when they finally did, the figure waiting outside wasn't a soldier or assassin or hooded spy. It was Malak, one of Naomi's oldest family friends, a man Ruth had always known as kind and gentle, someone who had shared bread with them on bitter nights and offered help without ever asking for something in return. But tonight, he looked nothing like that man. His eyes were heavy, bloodshot, his mouth tense. He glanced over his shoulder before slipping inside, pulling the door shut behind him like he was afraid of who might be watching. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They know about the ring," he said to Boaz. "And they know you've come back. You don't have much time." Ruth stepped forward. "How do you know what they know?" she asked carefully. Malak hesitated. "Because I was one of them. Once. A long time ago." The room spun again. Naomi's gasp was audible, and Boaz stepped between Malak and Ruth instinctively. But Malak raised his hands, not in defense, but surrender. I was part of the council's inner circle when they first created the order, the mark, the symbol, all of it. It started as a way to protect Bethlehem, to preserve its traditions, its laws. But over time, it changed. It became something darker, more ruthless. When your name, Ruth, started circulating, when Boaz spoke your name in the council halls, I knew it was only a matter of time before they'd try to erase you. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a folded parchment. This is the list, he said quietly. Everyone involved. Everyone who voted to have Eli silenced. Everyone who marked Boaz for exile. Everyone who still believes you should be cast out before your bloodline taints theirs. Ruth took it with shaking hands, her eyes scanning names, familiar names. Men who had smiled at her in the market. Elders who had offered blessings. Friends who had shared meals in her home. Her stomach turned as the betrayal settled deep in her gut. This wasn't just conspiracy. It was systemic. And it had infected the very heart of the town she had tried so hard to call home. Boaz looked at her. We can expose them now. Go to the temple. Take this before the people. But Malak shook his head. It won't matter. They'll discredit you before you open your mouth. They've already started telling stories, twisting truths. There are whispers that Eli was a traitor, that you and Boaz plotted to overthrow the elders for power. They're setting the narrative before you can defend yourselves. Ruth felt a coldness wash over her. Every option she thought she had was being stripped away. If they went public, they'd be destroyed. If they stayed quiet, the lies would win. And worse still, anyone who stood by them would be in danger. And then Malak said the words that shattered what little hope Ruth had left. They want you to leave. Disappear. Tonight. If you do, they'll spare Boaz and Naomi. But if you stay, they'll make sure the next body found isn't a council elder, it's someone you love. It was the ultimatum she never saw coming. Leave and save the ones who had risked everything for her, or stay and fight, knowing full well the cost might be their lives. Ruth's legs felt weak. Naomi's hand slid into hers, trembling. Boaz looked at her, silent but defiant. He wasn't going to run. Not again. But the decision wasn't his. This burden was hers to carry. She stepped back, the parchment still clutched in her hand, the names of traitors burning through the paper like fire. Her thoughts were a storm. Images of Eli's pendant, of the scroll hidden beneath the floorboards, of Boaz's voice breaking as he revealed his father's ring, of Naomi's tearful confession and Malak's haunted eyes. None of this was black and white anymore. There were no easy lines between good and evil, no simple heroes or villains. There was only truth, and the terrifying price of standing for it. But even in her fear, Ruth knew something they didn't. She had come to Bethlehem with nothing but faith and loyalty. She had faced starvation, scorn, and sorrow. She had buried a husband, left a homeland, and chosen a path that no one believed in. And still she was standing. They could try to scare her. They could try to silence her. But if they thought she would abandon those she loved to protect herself, they had never understood who she truly was. And yet, just as Ruth felt her resolve beginning to rise, Malak stepped forward again, lowering his voice to barely a whisper. There's one name missing from the list, he said, eyes darting toward Naomi. I don't know how it happened, but someone tampered with the scroll. One of the signatures was erased. Someone on the inside tried to protect the conspiracy from ever being exposed. And whoever it was, they're still close. Closer than you think. The air went still. Ruth looked slowly at Naomi, her mentor, her guide, her family. But Naomi was already staring back, her face pale, her lips parted in stunned silence. And in that terrifying, heartbreaking moment, Ruth realized the question wasn't just who to trust anymore, it was whether she'd ever truly known who anyone was at all. And somewhere in the dark, beyond the lantern light of their home, the watchers were still waiting, ready to move the second she chose wrong. The room seemed to shrink as Malak's final words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Ruth felt the heat rise in her chest, the twisting sensation in her gut warning her that what she was about to face would not be just another layer of betrayal, it would be the unraveling of everything she had clung to as truth. Naomi's silence was deafening. She didn't protest. She didn't cry out in denial. She just stood there, her eyes wide, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, and for the first time since Ruth had known her, she looked afraid. But it wasn't fear for herself. It was the kind of fear worn by someone who had carried a secret for too long and knew it was about to explode into the light. Boaz stepped forward, his tone hard but restrained. "What is he talking about, Naomi?" His voice was quieter than Ruth expected, almost pleading beneath the intensity. Naomi didn't speak immediately. She turned slowly toward Ruth, her lips parted like she wanted to say something but didn't know where to begin. Finally, her voice cracked through the tension. "I thought I could fix it before it reached you. I thought if I could delay things, if I could play their game from the inside, I could protect you both." Ruth felt her knees threaten to give way. "You were part of it?" she asked, barely able to get the words out. Naomi shook her head quickly, stepping forward, reaching for Ruth's hands, but Ruth pulled away. Naomi's face twisted with anguish. "No, not like that. I was forced into it. After we came back from Moab, they approached me, told me you were a threat, that the elders had voted you too dangerous to be redeemed, that they couldn't allow a Moabite to be grafted into a bloodline destined for royalty. They didn't say why at first. Just gave me a choice. Stay silent and help steer you away from Boaz, or lose everything. And I believed them. I was grieving. I was broken. I thought if I stayed close, I could shield you from the worst of it." The room exploded with emotions, shock, rage, disbelief. Ruth took a step back, breath caught in her chest. "You let me walk into that field. You let me go to Boaz. You let me believe we had a future. All while you were covering for the people trying to destroy it." Naomi's voice broke as she spoke. "I didn't know how deep it went. I didn't know they would go after Eli. I didn't know they would kill to keep you from the truth. I swear, Ruth, I thought I could change their minds." Malak shook his head, stepping in. They never planned to be swayed. Naomi was their insurance. A beloved elder's widow, respected, trusted. If the town ever turned against the council, they would point to her as proof it wasn't about hate or blood. They used her. Boaz paced the floor, fury in his eyes now. "How many of them are left? How far does this go?" Malak looked down at the floor, his voice low and grim. "Farther than you know. This isn't just about Bethlehem. Word has traveled. Other towns. Other tribes. There are whispers that your union would fulfill an ancient prophecy, one that connects Ruth's bloodline to a coming king. They want to stop that from happening at any cost. This is about legacy. Power. They're rewriting genealogy itself." Ruth felt her world lurch beneath her. A prophecy? Her? She thought back to the strange whispers in the market, the veiled threats, the way even strangers looked at her like she carried something she didn't understand. She had thought it was because of her Moabite past, her foreign roots. But now it was something else, something holy, something dangerous. They weren't afraid of her because of what she was. They were terrified because of what she might become. Just then, the front door burst open. A young woman stumbled in, breathless and bloodied. It was Tamar, one of the girls Ruth had met during her early days in the fields, quiet, soft-spoken, always watching. "They're coming," she gasped. "They know about the scroll. They've sent men to the house. They're armed. They've closed off the road to the temple. You have to run. Now." Boaz didn't hesitate. He grabbed his satchel, reached for Ruth's hand, and turned to Naomi. "If we leave now, we can get to the highlands. There's a place there, an old outpost, built before the exile. They won't find us right away, but we need to move." Naomi, tears streaking her face, looked to Ruth. "I'll stay behind. I'll delay them. Let them believe you're still here." Ruth stared at her, torn between fury and sorrow. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to ask how someone she had loved like a mother could betray her so deeply. But there was no time for that now. The sound of hoofbeats echoed in the distance. The house trembled with every second lost. As they slipped into the night, Boaz led them down a narrow side trail behind the property, Tamar guiding them through back paths she had memorized from childhood. The darkness was thick, the silence between them even heavier. Ruth didn't speak. Her heart ached in ways she couldn't explain. The betrayal, the prophecy, the lives lost, it was too much, too fast. And yet, buried beneath the grief and shock was something else. Something burning. Resolve. They were running, yes. But not for safety. Not forever. They were running for the truth. And now, for the first time, Ruth understood just how big this was, not just for her, not even for Boaz. This was about generations. About what had been hidden for centuries. About the kind of legacy that could change history if it ever saw the light. But first they had to survive the night. The wind howled over the barren cliffs of the Judean highlands as Ruth crouched behind the crumbling wall of the old outpost, her chest heaving with exhaustion and nerves. The sun had dipped beneath the horizon hours ago, casting shadows that danced wildly across the stone as their torches flickered in the night. She could hear them, men on horseback, voices echoing off the rocks, boots thudding closer with every heartbeat. This wasn't just a chase anymore. This was war. Boaz stood a few feet ahead, eyes trained on the path below, where the council's riders had dismounted, their silhouettes black against the firelight. In the distance, the mountains whispered of ancient things, truths buried beneath generations of silence. And tonight, every one of them would rise. Inside the outpost, Malak unrolled the scroll, now freed from the protective cloth Naomi had used to hide it. The parchment, brittle and stained with time, bore markings unlike anything Ruth had seen before. Symbols of kings, bloodlines, and a prophecy written in a script long thought forgotten. It was the missing piece. The one document the council had tried to destroy. A record from the tribe of Judah itself, declaring that a descendant of Ruth, a Moabite, would one day birth a line that would deliver Israel's greatest king. It wasn't just about her marrying Boaz. It was about what came after. A son, a legacy, a divine thread that would eventually lead to David, and far beyond that, to a name still whispered in secret by prophets, Yeshua. But the council hadn't come to debate prophecy. They had come to end it. Suddenly, a thunderous crash shattered the tension as the outpost's door exploded inward. Splinters of ancient wood flew across the stone, and soldiers poured in with drawn swords, faces masked, eyes cold. Ruth instinctively stepped in front of Malak, shielding the scroll with her body. Boaz moved like a lion, knocking one of the men back with a forceful shove. But they were outnumbered, surrounded, pinned like animals with no escape. From the rear, a single man stepped through the smoke and dust, their leader, Eliar. Ruth's stomach turned at the sight of him. Once a trusted elder, Eliah had baptized her into the community, welcomed her in public while plotting her destruction in secret. He wasn't just a figurehead. He was the architect. The one who had fed the council's fears, twisted scripture into control, and silenced every voice that dared to challenge the ancient prejudice against outsiders. His voice echoed across the stone, rich with false calm. "You were warned, Ruth. We offered you safety, a chance to walk away. But now you've become the storm. You've forced our hand." Ruth's voice rose, strong despite her trembling limbs. "You tried to bury a prophecy with blood. You feared a future that didn't fit your version of tradition. But you forgot something. Truth doesn't die with the people you kill." Eliar's lips curled. "You think truth alone will save you? Look around. You're outnumbered. That scroll won't reach anyone. You won't live long enough to see the sun." But then came the sound that changed everything. Shouts. Not from the soldiers, but from beyond them. Dozens of torches flickering through the trees, carried by townspeople who had followed the clues Ruth had left behind. Among them were widows, farmers, shepherds, and even council defectors, people who had once been silent out of fear but now stood in the open, outraged by the corruption, the lies, the bloodshed. And leading them was someone Ruth never expected to see again. Naomi. Her face was bruised, her cloak torn, but her eyes blazed with the fire of justice. She held up a second scroll, one she had hidden for years, written by Ruth's late husband, Malin, just before he died in Moab. In it, he recorded what he had learned from a wandering priest about Ruth's family, descendants not of pagan roots as the council believed, but of a royal nomadic tribe connected to Abraham himself through Lot. The very thing that had been used to mark Ruth as unworthy proved her divine right to stand among the chosen. The soldiers hesitated. Eliar's composure cracked as murmurs rippled through the room. Naomi spoke, her voice commanding. "This is the truth. These are the people you've tried to silence. But tonight, the lies end. You can spill more blood, Eliar, but every drop will only birth more rebellion. Or you can step down, admit what you've done, and let history judge you." For a moment, everything stood still. The soldiers glanced at one another. A few lowered their weapons. One even stepped back. Eliar's face contorted with rage, but the power had shifted. He knew it. Ruth knew it. And just as he lunged toward the fire to destroy the scrolls in one final act of desperation, Ruth intercepted him. She tackled him with a force born from months of betrayal, grief, and resilience. They crashed into the stones, the scroll tumbling from his grip, landing safely in Boaz's hands. The crowd surged forward. The council's men dropped their arms, disarmed not by force, but by the undeniable power of truth now revealed in full. Eliar was seized by his own guards, shackled with the very chains he'd used to imprison others. And as dawn broke across the hills, bathing the land in golden light, Ruth stood before her people, not as an outsider, not as a widow, but as the mother of a future written by divine design. But just as the people rejoiced, just as it seemed the battle had been won, Boaz pulled Ruth aside, his face pale. "There's something I didn't tell you." From his satchel, he pulled a third scroll, marked with a broken seal. "I found this buried beneath the temple ruins before we fled. It's older than any of the others. And it doesn't just talk about your bloodline, it warns of another." Ruth stared at the parchment, her breath catching. On it was a single phrase translated loosely, "From the same seed shall rise the Savior and the shadow." She looked up at Boaz, the joy of victory dimming into a new kind of fear. The battle was over. But the war had just begun. The dawn after the chaos was unlike any Ruth had ever known. The valley below shimmered in soft golden hues as if heaven itself had breathed fresh light across the battered land. The temple ruins, once buried beneath layers of silence and fear, now stood exposed, each broken stone whispering secrets long kept hidden. Smoke from last night's fires still curled in the air, but instead of the stench of ruin, there was a cleansing calm, a sense that the storm had passed and left behind something sacred. The scrolls, now protected in the hands of those who had pledged to preserve them, had begun their journey to be transcribed, studied, and finally spoken aloud without fear. For Ruth, it was not just the survival of her truth, it was the recognition of it. The girl who once wandered into Bethlehem as a grieving foreigner had become the unwitting guardian of a prophecy that reshaped everything her people thought they knew about bloodlines, belonging, and divine favor. Yet even as the villagers gathered in peace, rebuilding their homes and mending broken alliances, a quiet weight still rested on Ruth's shoulders. Boaz stood beside her, loyal and steady, but the scroll he had revealed, the one that whispered of a future not only marked by light, but by shadow, had not left her thoughts. What did it mean that from her womb would come both savior and shadow? Could a bloodline hold such contradiction, such promise and peril intertwined? The priests had begun to debate the meaning, some believing the text referred to generations of kings, with one who would rise only to fall, another who would redeem all. Others saw it as a warning of spiritual battles yet to come, the kind that would not be fought with swords, but with the hearts of men. Ruth didn't pretend to have the answers. She no longer needed to. The peace she found wasn't in certainty, but in acceptance of her journey, its pain, its beauty, its divine interruptions. She stood one morning beneath the olive tree near Naomi's rebuilt home, feeling the warmth of a child growing in her belly, and she understood something she never could have known when this all began. Faith was not a destination. It was the path itself. It was walking forward when the road disappeared. It was holding the truth even when it burned your hands. It was loving a people who tried to exile you, healing a land that tried to erase you, and believing that legacy wasn't about what you left behind, but about what you set in motion. Naomi, once broken by loss, had found purpose again, becoming a teacher to the young women in the village, telling stories of their ancestors not as distant legends, but as living reminders of resilience. Boaz, ever the protector, began opening their storehouses to feed not just their own but the surrounding tribes, refusing to let borders define who deserved grace. And Ruth, whose name had once been whispered in suspicion, was now spoken with reverence, not because of her prophecy, but because of her choice to love fiercely, stand boldly, and believe in a God who saw her before anyone else did. The council, now disbanded and held accountable for their corruption, had been replaced by a new circle of elders, diverse, inclusive, and devoted to justice over power. And Eliar, once feared and revered, lived out his days in silence, watched but not worshipped, his name stripped of its former weight. No longer a voice of false righteousness, he had become a symbol of what happens when power replaces purpose. As the seasons turned and Ruth gave birth to a son named Obed, the village celebrated not just a child, but a chapter, one that connected the past to the future. The child's cry at birth was said to echo across the hills, a sound so pure that shepherds paused mid-step and turned their heads, as if time itself was listening. And though the prophecy had spoken of greatness to come, no one could know that this child's grandson would one day sling a stone that felled a giant, or that centuries later, his blood would course through the veins of a carpenter from Nazareth whose story would change the world forever. Even so, the mystery remained. The second scroll's warning still echoed in quiet hearts, raising questions that had no answers. Would the shadow rise alongside the light? Would future generations have to wrestle with the same doubts, the same dangers, the same corruptions wrapped in the guise of religion? Ruth never claimed to know. What she knew was this: truth will always find a voice, and hope, once planted, cannot be unrooted. She often walked the fields at dusk, watching the sun set over the wheat Boaz had once let her glean, now fully hers. And in those quiet moments, with her son in her arms and the wind stirring the stalks like ocean waves, she whispered the same prayer, that those who walk after her would carry not just her blood, but her bravery, that they would question what they are told, that they would seek justice even when it's inconvenient, that they would love even when it costs them everything, and that, above all, they would remember that even the smallest story, one of a foreign widow, forgotten by many, is worthy of being written into eternity. And just as the screen begins to fade and the music rises, a final whisper returns to the viewer's ears, gentle, haunting, unforgettable. A voice says, "What if your story is the next thread in this tapestry?" And then the screen cuts to black.